Howdy folks, and welcome back to World of Tanks with a mighty Jingles. Yes, my Christmas and New Year break is over. I'm back from Cyprus, and it's time for some tanks. More on the Christmas and New Year break and the trip to Cyprus to meet the CEO of Wargaming at their global headquarters, along with numerous other YouTubers, bloggers, and various different EU community contributors, coming up in next week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. But for now, it's back to tanks, and this is the Afk Panther, no longer in the game. Also known as the Afk Panther, or just the Awful Panther. It's been replaced at Tier 7 in the German tech tree as a light tank by the Sperrpanzer 1C. And this match was sent in just before the tank was replaced. Sort of last hurrah of the Afk Panther. It's being driven for us today by the Evil Goose, who was a big fan of this tank and was very sad to see it removed. And the thing about the Afk Panther, and this is something that you see with, well, particularly the new Soviet Tier 7 and 8 light tanks like the LTTB there and the T-54 lightweight, and well, they're not really light tanks, are they? The Afk Panther, for example, is basically a Panther with a scout turret and a, well, in this case, the 75mm Konish gun. The T-54 lightweight, for example, is probably a better medium tank than the T-44, which is a Tier 8 medium tank. Now, unlike his buddy in the LTTB, he's ignored the temptation to stop and skirmish with that M41 Walker Bulldog in the middle of the valley, and instead he's got himself in this very useful, very aggressive forward scouting position. And you can see right there, M41 Bulldog was not alone, and things have not gone very well for his buddy in the LTTB. Enemy light tanks as a whole are being very aggressive and very proactive in this assault map on Karelia, which is not something that you see too often, but it's absolutely the right thing for them to do. Yes, you have to defend when you're on the defending team in assault on Karelia, but that doesn't mean you have to defend from the cap circle. Speaking of very aggressive, check out this Churchill. We'll be generous and call that an aggressive move from the Churchill, but he's probably not going to last too long in that position. But while he's there, he can cause some considerable damage to Goose, so instead he pops around the rock, spots the enemy artillery, takes a light, high explosive hit from him, and then starts pumping shots into him with his 75mm Konish just before the artillery disappears from view. Third shot in the artillery's direction, doesn't kill him, pops out, takes another one, checks behind him, where's that Churchill? There's the artillery again. He was just unlucky with those shots, they missed. The artillery hasn't actually moved. His next shot bounces off the artillery. What's going on? Still getting very anxious about what's happening with that Churchill behind him, but the Churchill doesn't appear to be coming out, and he's no longer spotted, so he decides, screw it, glory lasts forever, chicks dig scars anyway, and he goes for it. What you'd normally expect to happen in this sort of situation is that Mark 7 Churchill would have been pinned down in those rocks by enemy tanks on the hill overlooking the centre of the valley, but there's just nobody there. In fact, the only people up there are an enemy T-71 who's managed to get around and is wreaking havoc with the artillery. Again, very aggressive play from the light tank drivers in this battle, so Goose is forced to deal with the Mark 7 Churchill completely alone, but he makes it look pretty easy. And this is where things can get a bit tricky, because once you've broken through the centre of the map here, there's almost always somebody camping when you're defending on Karelia, just sitting here in the spawn, but not today. Both teams were hyper-aggressive, they pushed out and they fought on the flanks, which makes it very easy to break through the middle here once you've dealt with the lone defenders like the AMX-12T and the Mark 7 Churchill. And there's the FB304, and just to add insult to injury, he finishes him off with a 9 health ammo rack and then sets the KV-85 on fire and pumps shot after shot into him as he slowly tries to turn the tower around, but it's just not fast enough. And now this Black Prince is doomed. He's been prevented from pushing up to support the KV-3 ahead of him by a 3001P on his flank, and now with Goose coming in from behind and he's taking shots from up on the hill ahead, there's just no way he's getting out of there. Rather than potentially grabbing an easy kill on the KV-3, who's been beaten into submission up there on the high ground to the northeastern end of the map, instead Goose decides to go around and assist this AMX ELC with an artillery kill. Ordinarily, you wouldn't expect an ELC to have too many problems dealing with something like an M40, but this M40 is pretty smart. He backs himself up against the rock so the ELC can't get around him, and he's turning around, and he almost gets this guy before Goose arrives, and, well, was that kill stealing? Or did he just save the ELC's arse? You be the judge. So 6 kills under his belt, 2 more for the Radley-Walters, and that's when he runs into the AT-7. Now, if the AT7 can get himself into a choke point, a nice strong defensive position, they can be very, very difficult to deal with, but he's not in a choke point, and this is not a strong defensive position. In fact, it's probably the biggest nightmare that an AT7 can ever experience. A light tank circling him, pumping shot after shot into everywhere where his armour is not the strongest, and that there's just no way this is ever going to end in anything but death. For the, hang on, oh, the ELC's managed to get himself in trouble again. Anyway, he saved the ELC again. There's his 7th kill. Can he get the Radley-Walters? Can he ram anybody? Because we haven't seen him ram anybody in this thing yet, and that's really what the Afk Panther was all about. No, he's just going to have to settle with shooting his way to a Radley-Walters medal in the last game he ever played in this German Tier 7 light tank before it was replaced by the Sparpanzer 1C. Coming up next, we have a bit of a controversial replay for you. It's artillery. Oh, yes. I don't often do artillery replays. They're usually pretty boring to watch. Unless something goes disastrously wrong, they don't get too interesting or exciting. This is one of the exceptions. This was a very, very amusing, entertaining and tense game to watch. This is Plobby Schlobby. That's his name, I didn't make it up. Plobby Schlobby in the German Tier 5 artillery, the Grille, here on the Sound River match. And this always confuses the crap out of me, because back in the day when I played artillery, the Grille was Tier 4 and the Hubble was at Tier 5, but obviously artillery got rebalanced, new machines were introduced, and so on and so on and so on. And this is really, really going back quite a while now. It tells you how long it is since I last played in the artillery that wasn't Bert the Avenger, the FV304. But regardless, it's now, and has been for a long time, the German Tier 5 artillery. And, you know, I'm really not too sure what to think of a machine like the Grille. It's not as hilariously broken as high-tier artillery is in World of Tanks. So when I say that, I mean it just doesn't work for both the people being shot at by high-tier artillery and the people doing the shooting. Everybody can point to an occasion where they've been driving along quite merrily in whichever Tier 8, 9 or 10 tank, and they've just been one-shotted by enemy artillery with no warning whatsoever. That sort of thing sticks in our mind because of the rank injustice of it all. However, what doesn't stick in our mind is the 5, 6, 7 or 8 times that the enemy artillery player has lined up a shot just like that in order for absolutely nothing to happen, because this is why it's so... This is why I just don't understand why people would want to play high-tier artillery in World of Tanks at the moment. Because it doesn't matter how much care, attention or skill you take lining up the shot and selecting your target. Once you press that fire button, anything can happen, and it's got absolutely nothing to do with you anymore. Down here at Tier 5, however, it's nowhere near as RNG dependent, and you do feel as if the kind of choices that you make and the targets that you select and the shots that you take, the skill and level of attention that you pay to the shots that you take matter more down here at Tier 5 than they do at high tier. And yet at the same time, you're still capable of doing things like that, which seems as if the balance still isn't quite there really, is it? If you can do that with a direct armour-piercing hit on an IS-7 in your T-92, for example, at Tier 10, but 7 times out of 10 you're going to miss and do no damage whatsoever, you do feel slightly justified, regardless of the rage that induces in the IS-7 driver, when the shot lands, and finally your patience is rewarded. But down here where you aim faster, load faster, are more accurate, and you're going to hit the target more often than not, and you can still one-shot them, well, you can begin to understand why people are upset with artillery. Plobby still can't hit that T-34, who's still alive despite still being a one-shot kill when that friendly B-1 came around the corner. The B-1's dead. The Churchill tried to get into the rocks and get himself artillery safe, but he'd been hit by multiple different targets. He'd been immobilised, he was on low health, and Plobby takes the kill on the Churchill as well. KV-1S up here, 60mm of side armour. Plobby's high explosive shells have 75mm of penetration. He's on full health, but he's given the side of his tank to everybody who's shooting at him. So this is probably not too surprising. At the same time, when you're on full health and somebody does that to you, well, stopping to analyse why it happened and accepting that perhaps it was actually your fault is probably the last thing that people do. The first thing they do is go onto the forums and complain about how overpowered artillery is. And there's a certain element of truth in that, because down here at Tier 5 you can aim faster, load faster, and stand a better than average chance of actually hitting the target that you aim at. And yet you can still one-shot a target. Should you be able to do that oh, hold on, we'll carry on this argument in a moment, because right now Blobby has just been spotted by the T-34. Momentarily at least, the T-34 is firing and missing. He is on very low health. He probably doesn't even need to hit the T-34 to kill him. But he waits, and he waits, and he waits. The T-34 is still firing, but it looks like he's firing blind. There's very little chance he's actually going to miss this guy. T-34 has taken far too long to kill him, especially with another artillery in play, the AMX there. And, yeah. And it's actually enemy artillery, and not the T-34, who are the only ones to do any damage to Plobby's gorilla. So they obviously realised exactly where he was hiding, being artillery players themselves, tried to finish him off, didn't score a direct hit, otherwise he would have been dead. But he's able to get out of there, relocate, and live to fire again another day. And this was one of the things that we were actually talking about at Wargaming's global headquarters in Cyprus earlier this week, when we met with some of their game designers. And it's to do with mostly the way that there is no natural enemy of artillery in World of Tanks anymore. It used to be the light tank, but that just isn't the case anymore. In fact, light tanks don't really have a role in World of Tanks these days. Oh sure, you might be able to have fun and get some good results if you're very good in a light tank, but there's just very little way for light tanks to threaten artillery by working their way around the flanks, for example, taking advantage of concealment and careful, skillful driving in order to threaten enemy artillery directly. You almost never see it happen anymore, and you almost never see it happen anymore because of the changes that have happened to the maps in World of Tanks. A lot of the concealment has been removed, and so the opportunities to actually get yourself around the flanks undetected and spot targets for your own artillery are just not there anymore. In fact, the phrase that they use is corridor shooter. With no concealment, the opportunity to work your way around the flanks becomes limited, and so people tend to funnel themselves into choke points where their flanks are protected, but where they become vulnerable to, you guessed it, hidden tank destroyers at the other end of the choke point. The theory was that these tank destroyers would be dealt with by enemy artillery, but with nobody able to spot them because you've removed the concealment from the maps. Other than at both ends of these choke points, for example, the light tanks can't get out there and spot the tank destroyers, and so what we see happening is what has actually happened in World of Tanks lately, the domination of tank destroyers. The only spotting opportunities for the light tanks tend to be in the middle of the map, which is why you see that the artillery is concentrating on the tanks that are actually fighting on the front line instead of doing what artillery is supposed to do and dealing with the campers at the back of the map. The artillery and the tank destroyers, they're not shooting at them because they can't see them. And of course the accuracy of artillery has been nerfed, so even if they could see them, they probably wouldn't be able to hit them. And Wargaming's fully aware of this, by the way. And so, while nothing's set in stone at the moment, 2016 is looking like it's going to be the year of the fix for World of Tanks. They're going to be changing the game mechanics in order to address a lot of the issues that they've basically made for themselves by the changes that they have implemented into World of Tanks over the last couple of years. That's not to say that they're not going to be pushing out any new content. Of course they are. But the focus is likely to be on fixing the things that are perceived and acknowledged to be wrong with the game. We had some very, very interesting discussions with Wargaming's designers in Cyprus, more of which I'll be going into greater detail on that in next week's episode of Mingles with Jingles, talking about all kinds of different things that they were thinking of trying out, because there's obviously no one magic bullet. They can't just say, right, we're going to do this and it's going to fix everything that's, I'd hesitate to use the word wrong, but all of the issues that people have with World of Tanks. And it's not just artillery and light tanks, there's things like the matchmaking and so on and so on and so on. But there's a whole range of different things that they're thinking of testing out in order to try to address some of the more glaring problems that people do have with World of Tanks. But that's something that I'll be going into in much greater detail in this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. But it did seem relevant to mention it, given what's going on in this particular battle in the Tier 5 Grilla with Plobby Schlobby here on Sound River, as he lines up his next guaranteed kill, an open-topped tank destroyer. Just hold still a second, it will all be over soon. And yeah. Oh crap, okay, he's in serious trouble for the first time. That Churchill 3, who hasn't been spotted since he was well, pretty much driving out of his own spawn point, has managed to work his way all the way around. Now this is the Tier 5 Churchill 3 Lend-Lease Soviet premium tank, which has up to 176mm of armour at the front. On the side, not so much. And again, he's one-shotted a top-tier heavy tank. But again, he's done it because this guy just gives him the weakest armour on the machine. And enemy artillery desperately trying to punch his ticket and coming pretty close. But it's all over. Bother shouting now. It's artillery versus one tank destroyer. He's just gotten himself his Radley-Walters medal with his 8 kills. All you have to do is stay alive. Don't do anything stupid. There's no longer anybody left alive to spot for the enemy artillery unless they get ridiculously lucky with the RNG. This is a win. They just have to stay alive for the next couple of seconds. And Plobby Schlobby has got a win and a Radley-Walters in the Griller German Tier 5 artillery. And that was actually his first ever Radley-Walters medal, as well as his first ever Starks medal, which is a medal only available to artillery players, as well as the Top Gun, the High Caliber, and the Ace Tanker badge. And regardless of how you feel about artillery in World of Tanks, and trust me, I feel your pain, you have to admit that he did play very well in that match and thoroughly deserved that result. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you'll join me on Monday for Mingles with Jingles, where I'll be going into much greater detail about some of the proposed changes that Wargaming have for World of Tanks in 2016 as a result of the discussions that I had at their global headquarters in Cyprus earlier on this week. As always folks, take care, and I'll catch you next time.